I am Rachel Caruso, and I am doing my project on young adult literature and high school curriculum, which I believe to be a good fit. So a little bit of background here. I started working at Northrop High School here in Fort Wayne in December, and found out that I surprisingly really love working with teenagers. And I work with a couple different English classes, and I noticed that there was this huge, very obvious disengagement with the students and what they were expected to read. They knew from what their parents had to read in high school exactly what they were going to be reading every year, which is, you know, they're automatically checked out because they're like, my parents didn't even like this book, so why would I like it? So that kind of struck a chord with me because I'm really interested personally in young adult literature. When I choose to read, that's what I read. And I'm looking at this genre that I'm so interested in and thinking, wow, this would be an absolutely perfect fit for high schoolers because that's who it's actually written for. So for my project, I did obviously the presentation, the research paper, and then I also did a recommended book list, which is here on the chair. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And I conducted 2 surveys, one for teachers and one for students regarding their attitudes about young adult literature. So as I stated, the problem here is that young adult literature is huge right now. It grows exponentially every year, especially since about the turn of the 21st century, maybe late 90s. It's just continued to grow and grow and grow, and it's obvious that that's what teens are interested in and what they're interested in reading. And yet school districts and state standards have not reflected this whatsoever. And because of this, students are just continually disengaged, not interested, and refusing to get involved in their English classes, especially at the high school level. So basically my thesis is that is not to get rid of classic literature by any means, but rather to incorporate young adult literature into classic literature by a process called scaffolding, which we'll talk a little bit about here in a second. So it's important to define young adult literature because young adult literature has a lot of misconceptions. Typically people tend to walk into Barnes & Noble and look at the section for YA Lit and go, yeah, that's for preteen girls. And thank you, Twilight, for that. So that's not it at all. There's so much that is not juvenile and is not just intended for young girls. There's so much that's relevant to older kids and even to adults. And the most important aspect to remember about about young adult literature is that it incorporates aspects of both children's and adult literature. So it kind of serves as a bridge between the two. So it's got those simplified plot structures, simplified characters that you would associate with children's literature, but it's also got these really adult, mature themes that are, you know, only typically associated with adult literature. And what qualifies as young adult literature a lot of times depends on the reader, their maturity level, their reading comprehension, what have you. So some common themes to kind of talk about how deep young adult literature can actually be. So most of these are self-explanatory. The 2 that I want to mention just a little bit in detail are dystopian literature and mental health themes. So dystopian literature is, without having the data in front of me, probably the most prominent of all young adult literary genres right now. It's huge. Everywhere you look, there's young adult literature, or there's dystopian literature. Dystopian literature is typically associated with some kind of like cataclysmic event that took place in the near future that either wiped out the population or destroyed the planet or something to that extent, where it allowed for a new governmental structure to take over. And this new government structure is inherently corrupt. It makes its lower class very downtrodden, almost enslaved. And the protagonist of young adult dystopian literature is usually a teenager who is part of this lower class. So there's a lot of themes of leadership and advocacy for change and that kind of thing. And I think that's really interesting that that's what teenagers are most interested in reading. That says a lot for the maturity of our next generation of teenagers. Also, mental health. Mental health the importance of mental health in young adult literature cannot be understated. There are so many teens that deal with anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, bipolar, autism, what have you, and these students, these young adult books serve as something of like an education for these issues that they're dealing with, but also resources for help and to not feel so alone. And especially when teenagers are so susceptible at the ages that they are, that's so important. And I think it's great that that's been a huge trend in young adult literature as of late, especially with like John Green and some of his novels. So as far as the surveys that I did, the surveys were really interesting. I had a couple, for the student one, I had 46 participants. Most were either high school students or college students, or recent high school graduates. And the thing I want to touch on here is that over 3/4 said that they would choose to read young adult literature before any other kind of literature. And the same percentage said that they would be, quote unquote, thrilled to read these either instead of or in addition to what they currently read at the high school level. So that's very telling that this is what is exciting for these kids. It's what they would prefer to read. As for the teachers I got a little bit more kickback, which would be expected because most of these teachers were teachers at Northrop that were currently teaching and had a little bit more to say on the topic, which is understandable. But even so, 2/3 of the teachers felt strongly, a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale, that students would react positively to being taught these novels in a classroom setting in high school. The other important thing that they brought up was when asked about the biggest obstacle to teaching young adult literature in high school, they listed a whole bunch of things. And I like to think that I cover most of these in this project. So they say lack of precedent, which makes sense because this is a very contemporary genre. It's one of the most contemporary literary genres, starting with S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, usually, in 1967. So that's about 50 years old, which is very young for a literary genre. So that makes sense that they're worried about, you know, which novels to teach. I don't know which ones work, which ones don't. Unfamiliarity with the genre, which is the point of going through all of this to hopefully break through some of that. And also a lack of curriculum flexibility, which we will talk about next here. So when we talk about the advocacy for young adult literature at the high school level, we have to talk about Lexile levels because that is the number one biggest obstacle to incorporating young adult literature. Lexile levels are essentially reading levels, but the process for getting a Lexile level is a little bit more sophisticated. Essentially, Lexile levels for a book deal with the vocabulary usage and the sentence complexity. They typically do not have anything to do with themes or literary devices or anything like that. So they're covering about half of what's important realistically. But yet, even though these Lexile levels are not all-inclusive, they are treated as such by state and district standards. So they range from 0 to 2,000, with 2,000 being college-level reading. But the 8th graders and above at the average reading level are considered to be reading at 1,000 and above. And that's 8th grade and increasing into college-level reading eventually. But many teachers that I talked to at Northrop estimated that a good portion of the high school students at Northrop and at most public schools are reading well below this level. And the level has not been adjusted since the advent of the Lexile level, even though there's students that are continually underperforming according to this scale. The biggest obstacle with young adult literature is that it typically has a low Lexile level. There are exceptions, of course, but it typically falls between 700 and 800, which is below the average reading for high schoolers, or what is expected for high schoolers. But my argument is that what it lacks in sentence complexity and vocabulary, it makes up for in these really deep themes that we mentioned earlier, these themes that are really relevant and very mature, actually. An example of this that I wanted to give was that many of you have heard of A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. Wonderful books. I love those books. But they are a little bit more on the juvenile end. They're something that you would give early middle school, if not late elementary school. But these are really high rated on the Lexile scale. They're 1010, which is high for young adult literature. Whereas The Hunger Games, which deals with themes like government corruption, pitting kids against each other for sport, the poverty issues, all kinds of really deep, impactful themes, ranks at only 810, which is much below what students should be reading in high school. So this is just an example of how arbitrary the scale actually can be. So I'm not going to expect you to read all of this, obviously, but just for reference, the state standards in Indiana, the Common Core standards, are wonderfully vague. They are extremely ambiguous. This paragraph, this guiding principle paragraph, is identical for English literature education grades 8 through 12. Each grade is identical. And it basically, in summary, says students should read a wide range of genres from a wide range of time periods and continue to expand upon previous knowledge. That's pretty much all it says. There's no specifics. There's no, they have to read this novel, they have to read this novel, they have to be reading at this level. So most of the actual specifications come from the districts. I use Fort Wayne Community Schools as my example here because that's what I have access to currently, but none of this should be pointing fingers at Fort Wayne Community Schools because this is extremely common. Even the high school district I went to is very similar to this. So basically, at Fort Wayne Community Schools, freshmen read Romeo and Juliet and the Odyssey, sophomores read Julius Caesar, juniors read The Crucible, and seniors read Beowulf. Other than that, teachers are given a list of highly recommended books to fill in the rest of the time. All of these books, which I haven't listed, but take my word for it, all of these books are either very, very antiquated, or all nonfiction, or they are all still classics. None of them are modern young adult literature. And the one quote that I wanted to pull, this is in summary of the book list that Fort Wayne Community Schools gives out. They say, teachers should select a novel from the below approved list. The below options will provide Fort Wayne Community School students with a common reading experience. The majority of time spent reading at the secondary level should be based on student choice. So after telling you this is what you should be reading and this is what you definitely should be reading, they say, but let the kids decide. So basically there's some flexibility, but there's just no common theme where young adult literature is actively being accepted, unless you talk to like the media centers because they're all about it. So my theory for how we go about entwining young adult literature into canonical literature, we have to first talk a little bit about the canon because I have a lot of opinions about the canon. As an English lit student, I love canonical literature, I love classic literature, but the canon itself was pretty much created by a bunch of literary critics in the 1930s, and they were a very homogenous group of old Western European descent white guys. And the canon has gone through very little change since then. And people just kind of put it on this pedestal and treat it as though it is the only transmitter of literary culture, which, in my opinion, why are we letting a bunch of old white guys decide what's still important almost 100 years later? The canon is obviously important because it is so disseminated in our culture by this point, but it should be seen as only a part of our literary culture as America and as an English-speaking country in general. So in order to incorporate things into this canon. There's a term that a literary critic thought of called scaffolding. Scaffolding is basically where you would take a young adult literature novel that has a very obvious common theme or literary device or just overall plot structure as a classic novel. And you teach the young adult novel first. And you get the students acclimated to whatever this new aspect is. And then later, after they're acclimated and more ready for it, then you introduce classic literature, just like a scaffold on a building. So an example of this would be, as freshmen, Fort Wayne Community School students have to read the Odyssey by Homer. Well, they read an abridged version. They don't read the whole thing. Thank God. And so currently, all the teachers that teach the Odyssey teach like a 3 or 4 day crash course in Greek mythology, which, if you know anything about Greek mythology, is a horrible idea because everything's arbitrary. But anyway, so they're trying to teach these very complicated family trees and the importance of mythology to Greek culture and what all these gods and goddesses are associated with, and these kids are like, what is going on? Like, I don't understand any of this. And then they're like, okay, now read the Odyssey. And the Odyssey's wonderful, but these kids have little to no prior knowledge of any of this. So instead, with scaffolding, you could teach something, especially to freshmen, such as Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, which is a really quick read. It's a little bit more on the juvenile side, but it's a quick read that's basically a very straightforward and interesting introduction to Greek mythology. And you get the kids like familiar with the characters, and then you bring in the Odyssey. So by the time you're reading the Odyssey, they've done all the pre-work and they're ready to actually start engaging with the classic text. So before we wrap up here, just a minute to talk about this recommended book list, which everyone should take a copy of on their way out. I think I have enough for everyone. So in order to facilitate this shift towards young adult literature, I have created a recommended young adult book list that is not comprehensive of all the good young adult literature, but I included a lot of classic young adult literature that's easily recognizable, but then I also included a lot of really, really modern young adult literature that shows how dynamic and constantly changing this genre is. And I also included Lexile levels on this list, but none of the books were chosen for their Lexile level. They were all chosen either for thematic content or for their ease of connection to a classic novel. So in conclusion, young adult literature is an incredibly flexible, dynamic genre that is continually underrated. A lot of common takeaways from this genre are that it gives teenagers a reason to speak up, it gives them a voice, it gives them something to connect with that is still literature. And that's the most important thing as far as them becoming passionate, actual readers in their adult lives. So the best way to mold students into actual readers is to not just throw the classics at them, it's to scaffold with something that they're actually interested in first and then introduce the classics later. And hopefully this would facilitate students becoming readers for the rest of their lives, which is the goal. All right, that's it.
All right, questions?
How do you feel about using other media resources as companion books? I can't think of a good example right now. I'm thinking maybe Lion King and Hamlet. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
But having the students watch a movie that kind of gives them that, they can draw those correlations. Is that something that you think is acceptable, or you'd rather see it print form?
I have mixed feelings about that because I have seen there are a lot of teachers at Northrop that do this. So like before they teach Romeo and Juliet, they show Romeo plus Juliet, the Leonardo DiCaprio one. Yeah, which is wonderful. But so a lot of teachers do this where they find other media that is relative or related to the actual print. And I think that's great. I think it's a great supplement. But I also think that we need to engage students as far as picking up a book and actually reading something. And I think that the best way to do that is to just give them a little bit of an easier read first. But I think if time allows, that showing them, you know, Hamlet or Lion King for Hamlet is relevant also, because it shows them different takes on the classics, and I think that's really important as well.
This is great, Rachel.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, in terms of like the pushback you got from teachers, or you think you might get if you did another survey or something like that, something that I think a lot of us, you know, are coming to realize, if we didn't know it already, is that teachers, you know, whatever level they are, they don't have the luxury of a lot of time, right? Or a lot of resources necessarily. And I'm wondering if a lot of the pushback from them might be related to the time that would have to be invested to coming up with these new lesson plans for these works. Is that something that you think you could find a way to accommodate in the structure you're talking about?
Yeah, actually, I'll give an example. So a couple years ago, a couple teachers from the Fort Wayne Community School District, I think one from Snyder and two from Northrop, got together and created a full unit lesson plan for the Hunger Games. It's this big binder like that thick, and it's got everything in it. And then these teachers, actually, one of them retired and the other two went on to work in curriculum. So I think that a lot of this needs to come from some of the people that have the time to do this, i.e. the curriculum people, that can, you know, form committees like, hey, you guys get together and collectively put together a lesson plan for this unit. And then not only just have one teacher teach it, but have it taught for a whole year for all the freshman teachers, something like that. That's more of a group effort. It's a little more collaborative instead of just setting all the teachers loose to do their own thing.
This is kind of a follow-up question to that as well. So I can see from an administrator's viewpoint where that might be problematic as well if they're looking at the accountability and the standards, and also the financial, the budget issues about buying those texts if they're already strapped, and also parents on the other end. So which of those do you think, in your experience, you know, I understand, I think the teachers too would have that. I think that the students and the teachers would innately think this is a really good idea. But of the administratively and parents, how might that be easier to help sell that to parents and administrators as a good pedagogical approach?
Yeah. So I would actually point to media centers for high school, their libraries, for a lot of this. At least in Northrop's Media Center, they make an effort to create book sets throughout the course of a year. So right now, Northrop's Media Center has book sets for like 10 different contemporary young adult novels that teachers can just take and use as needed. So as far as the financial aspect, I think that the media centers do a lot to facilitate that and to help kind of ease that burden a little bit. As for parents, parents, especially very, you know, contemporary parents, typically don't have much of an issue with this as far as I can tell, and the ones that do, because I know, like with Mr. Witzegruder, our principal at Northrop, he has had a couple parents come in and, you know, make a fuss about the books that are in the library at Northrop, and these are the books that students are reading anyway. He showed them like, statistics of how popular these books are and how important it is to have them in our library, even if you don't allow your particular student to read them, how important they are for all the other students to be able to read. So actually, because there's such a parallel between young adult literature and classic literature in terms of themes, many of the themes that are controversial in young adult literature are also present in classic literature. So kind of showing that to parents and making that connection, like you read this at that age, that tends to help quite a bit. So, yeah.
So I have a question. I was not educated in American high schools, so this is all new to me in a way until my kids reach to that level. But I'm curious to at what capacity are the teachers restricted in choosing these books? Are the lists created by the district or by the schools?
Yeah, so they're district they're district book lists, and the ones that I listed, like the Beowulf and Crucible and all that, those are absolutely required. The rest of the books that I just kind of mentioned in passing that were kind of antiquated, not young adult books, those are the highly recommended book list. That is exactly how it reads. And there's a district expectation, but not requirement, that these books be read. That's how vague it is. It's very vague.
So how flexible are the teachers to kind of veer off that? Like if they do these books, how flexible is it for them to veer off that list?
The teachers, at least at Northrop, that have wanted to veer off the list have received very little setbacks. We have Mr. Witzegruder's a pretty fun principal. He likes all of this newfangled stuff, and he'll pretty much allow a teacher, as long as they've done the work and they've put together a lesson plan, if they want to do the work and want to go that extra mile, they don't typically receive a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of obstacles. So yeah, it's vague to an extent is the best answer I can give you.
Did you happen to look into how this could benefit either special needs students or students who were held back and otherwise would not be able to benefit from reading at all?
I didn't look into special needs students specifically. The closest I got to that was looking into how it affects ESL students, who I work really closely with. So the ESL students that I work with are level 1, so they're brand new to the country. They speak very, very little English. And the ESL teachers actually have even more flexibility. They can pretty much teach these kids any books they want. And they, this year, read a very simplified version of the novel Speak and of the novel Divergent, and absolutely loved it, and it did a lot for their reading comprehension skills in English. But as far as like particularly special needs students that can't or don't read, I didn't quite get that far.
So did you encounter any teachers who were, like I agree, as someone who teaches medieval literature, I completely agree with your, like, the concerns about the canon and problems with the canon, and like I am concerned about Beowulf being taught in high schools as someone who has a PhD
right.
in Beowulf because of why it is there in the canon and like how poorly understood it is, I think, among even, the best intentioned teachers. But I was wondering if you encountered teachers who were like supportive of this kind of old-fashioned idea of the canon, or on the other hand, are happy teaching these difficult texts. Like, does that happen?
Oh, absolutely. And I hate to stigmatize like this, but most of the older teachers that have been teaching for a long time do not want to change. Actually, Fort Wayne Community Schools is doing a huge curriculum overhaul right now, and they basically made all of the curriculum people downtown reapply for their jobs. And a lot of them left or retired because they didn't want to learn new tricks. So you're seeing a lot of this same kind of stubbornness from high school teachers that have been doing these same standards for years and either don't want to make new lesson plans or are genuinely concerned about the canon, which I totally understand. Like I said, I love the canon. I think the canon's great. But I think that the most important thing that I would say to them would be that the canon cannot and should not be the only source of culture for literary knowledge. So, but yes, there definitely is a lot of that.
That was so awesome.
Thank you.
That was really amazing. Thank you so much. My question is, how do you think it fits into college? And can that be a sell, like for educators and administrators? How would it better help students prepare for college? Or, I don't know, what could we do? Because I'm going to have a lot of 131 students soon who are just coming from college. So I wonder how all that could fit together.
Yeah, so that's actually a huge selling point, is that colleges even more quickly and more readily than high schoolers or high schools are turning towards young adult literature. I took an entire class on communication where she just taught all 7 Harry Potter books, and it was fantastic. This is pretty much the only reason I took that class, but it was great. But anyway, yeah, I think that actually one of the survey results that I didn't post, but I definitely got, was that almost all of the teachers, like 80-some% of the teachers that I surveyed, were not introduced to young adult literature until college. So there is a very obvious trend that universities see the value in young adult literature and are more and more teaching it and turning to it as often as possible. So I think that, you know, if I were to present this to the curriculum department, would be a huge selling point. So, yeah.
So this percentage that you just mentioned was based on Fort Wayne Community Schools, right?
It was based on the people that I surveyed, which were mostly Fort Wayne Community Schools teachers,
Okay.
yes.
Do you think there is a big difference between the level of the teaching in literature in English literature between Fort Wayne Community Schools and other districts around here?
I think they're pretty similar for the most part. I mean, I went to Angola, and Angola was actually even more conservative as far as what they allowed students to read. But yeah, I think at least in Indiana, these district standards are pretty standard. They're pretty flat across the board. This is what you get for most public school districts in Indiana. So.
And
yeah.
One more question. Well, one comment is I would like to see the comparison between the districts, you know, at
Yeah.
some point in the future, but also in the long term, but in 10 years, 20 years from now, how do you imagine the level of the young adult literature teaching will change between, you know, in the long term?
Yeah, I think that as time goes on, I think that teachers will see that this is not just a fad, that young adult literature is not just like something that's going to be really popular for a couple years and then go away. I think that it's going to continue to grow and evolve and be this really interesting genre, and then teachers will start, once it gets past the fad phase, they're going to start seeing the value in it and start coming to it more on their own than they would otherwise. And then from then on, you know, once you get enough teachers that are actively and routinely teaching young adult novels in the classroom, then you're going to get the districts and the states saying, okay, maybe it's time for a change. But I think that it's going to come from the teachers first. So.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Rachel.